We'll start in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for the rest of the people to come in. And I'm sending to everybody a link to the schedule for today. I'm going to get started now. Welcome to Philosophers and the Archives, an introduction to archival research. My name is Lynne Farrington, and I'm the Director of Programs and Senior Curator in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts here at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. I have degrees in English and philosophy and worked in archives both as an undergraduate and graduate student and across my career in rare books and manuscripts, so I'm familiar with both worlds. Today, we look forward to giving you an overview as well as some pointers from two Penn faculty who have worked extensively in both North America and European archives and libraries. I expect some of you may be familiar with working in archives, while for others, this is new territory. But hopefully we will all get some useful insights from one another. Presentations will be short to allow plenty of time for your questions. Please look at today's schedule, which I just posted in chat. We'll divide our time into 3 one-hour segments with a short break between the hours. I'll introduce speakers as we go along. So why a workshop on archival research? As you well know, over the centuries, many contributions by women and other marginalized groups have been lost to the historical record, either completely erased or so well hidden that they have never reemerged. Other contributions, if lucky, have existed simply as footnotes to the work of those men who had access to networks of inquiry and power through libraries, universities, and learned societies. Publications highlighted their work, often ignoring or purposely excluding the contributions of the many women, servants, and enslaved peoples who also engaged in the exploration and interrogation of philosophical ideas. So, how do we go about discovering the contributions of these marginalized figures and use what we learn to rewrite the history of philosophy? Well, some materials vital to this project have been published and remain accessible, even if they're not always widely studied by students of philosophy. Other materials may have once been published in small numbers or privately and have now basically disappeared from the purview of those who teach and study philosophy. Other materials exist only in collections of manuscripts and other related types of materials in institutions like archives and libraries and even historic houses. We will look at archives in both the narrow and broader senses of the word, both focused on traditional archival collections, wherever they are housed, and more broadly on collections of print resources, whether collections of pamphlets or other print ephemera, or simply rare and unknown works, many anonymously or pseudonymously published. As an example, how about exploring an early 19th century novel written by a woman in which the heroine navigates a Catholic father, rationalist brother, and Quaker uncle, and ends up studying for herself and reading Voltaire. Anne Rakes Harding, the author of this work, wrote a series of novels with similar titles, raising questions about women engaging with philosophical thought. And though her works show up in some online resources, like the 19th century collections online, they do not appear to have been closely studied, unlike those works by Elizabeth Hamilton and Mary Hayes, who wrote in response to the revolution controversy of the 1790s, exploring revolutionary ideas about a broader franchise, primogeniture, meritocracy, marriage, and divorce, and whose works have been republished by Broad Street Press, making them available once again. Other materials exist in archives where they may not have seen the light of day since they were created, or have been bypassed by scholars for centuries, or they may still exist in families or smaller repositories and not in major institutions. So it is important for new narratives to interrogate the archives in new ways by reassessing correspondence that alludes to collaborators and interactions, but doesn't always explicitly identify them, by re-examining research materials and drafts for evidence of work in other hands, by reconsidering the role of the amanuensis as more than a simple scribe, by reviewing family correspondence where extant for mentions of involvement by members of the household or others, and by reevaluating commonplace books, recipe books, and other works by women that are not normally considered as containing philosophical thought. Research is a slow process. It can lead you on a wild goose chase, only to drop you at a dead end. It can also branch off into unexpected directions, forcing you to change the questions you are asking as you make new discoveries. It is by nature never linear, and if it proves to be, you should be wary. Archival research requires an openness to serendipity and a willingness to be led astray as you seek those earlier attempts to understand humanity and the world. There are many strategies for finding materials in the archive, some straightforward, some not so. However, before going into these strategies, it's important to recognize the silences in the archives as well as the voices. What is collected, by whom, and under what conditions are a few of the questions you should ask yourself as you begin your research. You will find that you sometimes need to think outside the box. One approach is starting with known figures and exploring the networks of family, friends, and acquaintances. This includes looking at the circle around a particular figures in philosophy. You might begin by reviewing the correspondence of known philosophical figures for women. An obvious example is Descartes, who corresponded with Elizabeth Stuart, the Princess of Bohemia, and Christina, Queen of Sweden. Their letters can be found on the Electronic Enlightenment website. Letters by many other women can also be found on this website. The same holds true for male figures writing about women, exploring where they get their ideas and whether any women were involved in the development of their views. This collection continues to grow, and new discoveries any one of you might make one day could be added to this resource. Refining what is considered philosophical to include genres where women and marginalized figures may have expressed their philosophical insights and arguments is really important. This includes looking more closely at various forms of literature, including novels, poetry, and plays, commonplace books, natural philosophy, memoirs, including religious memoirs, and recipe books. The new narratives bibliography of works by early modern women philosophers is clearly a starting point, as it provides a list of genres. Although the number of works listed currently under particular categories is sometimes small, or as is the case with scientific works, 0. Another excellent source for these works in the early modern period is The Other Voice in Early Modern Europe. Both the Chicago and Toronto series have brought together a wide variety of works by women that scholars have already recovered, but may not always have been on the radar of philosophers. Both Lisa Shapiro and one of today's presenters, Joan DeJean, have books in the Chicago series. There are certainly other voices out there that have yet to be included and other materials yet to be discovered for those whose works are represented in the series. Sometimes philosophical thinking is embedded in prefaces, such as here, where a philosophy of education prefaces a text intended to be read to children. This work is Lady Eleanor Fenn's The Rational Dame, circa 1785, though as you can see, no author appears on the title page. Here it's important to mention again anonymous and pseudonymous works, as often being by women. Fenn herself used various pseudonyms. Here she signed the preface A Rational Dame. Elsewhere she went by Mrs. Teachwell or Mrs. Lovechild. One must be careful in the case of multiple pseudonyms to search under all of them. Moreover, one must remain aware of the past misidentification or misattribution of materials to men that were actually by women. Within the archive, we see here a commonplace book of a young woman reader in mid-19th century England, in which she copied out sentences, paragraphs, and extended passages from the work she was reading, extracts which clearly must have struck her as useful or important for what they had to say about good and evil, life, death, and love. Her reading material is primarily fiction, mainly contemporary novels written by women. Sometimes we are starting from what is known, even if limited, about a particular figure, even if just a reference in a printed work or correspondence. This often means working backward from what is currently known to what may be hidden. As I mentioned earlier, archival research can also involve querying print repositories for early but currently little or unknown publications by women across genres. Sometimes we become aware of these figures from works that only come on the radar when they emerge while browsing in online and physical catalogs of institutions and booksellers. One interesting example here is from a bookseller's online list, and it's of a 1786 history of learned women in Italy, most likely by a woman who remains unnamed, and who gives us information about many of these women and discusses, among other things, the thought of the philosopher Montesquieu. Alas, this copy was sold before I could order it for Penn's collection, but thankfully there is a copy of this incredibly rare work in the British Library. Finally, reconsidering figures who were dismissed by authorities for their views, such as show up in the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, is another place to look. With all this in mind, my colleague Holly Mengel will now speak on what is an archive in the general sense of the word and how are they organized. Holly is head of archives and manuscript processing in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. Her primary responsibility is preparing archival collections for use by researchers, and she works most frequently with collections from the 19th to the 21st centuries. She's been working in the field since earning her MLIS in 2002, and she's an absolutely wonderful person to teach us about archives. She does it with grace and with great intellect. So thank you, Holly.
Hi, everyone. Give me 1 second to share my screen. All right, hopefully you can all see that. Okay. Well, as Lynn said, I'm Holly Mengel, and I am, in fact, the head of Archives and Manuscripts Processing at the University of Pennsylvania's Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts. I work with archival collections before they become available to researchers, and in the process of my work arranging and describing material, I'm privileged to get to know a collection, the creator, and the world in which they lived. Lynn has asked me to talk about what an archival collection is, how archivists arrange and describe collections, what a finding aid is, and how our work affects you all as researchers. For those of you who are archives experts, please bear with me as I do a very brief and very general overview. An archival collection is the paper and now frequently electronic documentation of a person, family, business, or organization. Generally speaking, archival material is generated as a byproduct of work and life and is not usually created with the intent to be viewed by others, unlike a book, a piece of music, or a piece of art, which is expressly created to be displayed or distributed. Because a person, family, business, or organization does not operate in a vacuum, in other words, parts of their lives or work interweave with other aspects of their lives and work, the products of their work and life are therefore frequently interconnected. As a result, archival material generated by a person, family, company, or organization is kept together as a unit or a collection because it has more value and context than any one piece of paper has on its own. So context for me is one of the most central factors to keep in mind when working with archival collections. I don't know how easy this is going to be since I can only see a small number of you, but could participants yell out if they've ever heard of John Mockley?
I have not.
Okay, so I'm going to go with no one. So John Mockley, along with his even less well-known colleague, J. Presper Eckert, invented the ENIAC, arguably the first all-electronic computer in the world in 1945. This graphic, which has been around online so long that I cannot trace its origin, shows how computer technology stems from this one single invention, and this goes only into the early 60s. Mockley and Eckert spent the rest of their lives in the field inventing computers, including the EDVAC and their most successful computer, the UNIVAC, developing programming and advancing research and technology. They diminished the size and expense of computers, and Mockley predicted in 1963 that people would be carrying computers in their pockets by the 1980s. So how in the world is it that this man is virtually unknown? So I like to think of archival collections like puzzles. They almost always have a few obvious pieces that are easy to put into place. For Mockley, that would be the ENIAC and his other computers. But the material in his collection fills in the other pieces. The fact that he was a physicist and not a businessman, that he wanted knowledge to advance, and he expected all other people to believe that and do exactly what he would do. And that the world and even the companies who purchased his ideas might not have been ready for the way he thought and worked. Every one of these pieces of the puzzle helps researchers to understand the obvious pieces as well as a larger branch of his life. Researchers should understand that one collection will rarely, if ever, have the full story or contain all the documents that tell the story. A really oversimplified way to think of an archival collection is to think of it as the contents of a person's house or office when they die. Whatever is physically there is in their collection, but anything that that person sent to someone else will be in their house when they die and therefore part of their collection. So a really good example of this is correspondence. You will rarely find both sides of a correspondence in one collection. Instead, to find the full correspondence, you would need to look at the archival collections of both the sender and the recipient. And that's assuming that all parties' collections were saved and donated to a repository that makes them available. To fully research John Mockley's impact, it would be necessary to look at collections in all of these repositories and more. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that to be a good researcher, you really need to be a detective. And I think archival research is really hard work, but I would also say it's super fun. So as Lynn also mentioned, the final thing I'd like to talk about before moving on to the nitty-gritty of processing and finding aids is archival silence. This could be the subject of hours of discussion, but I'm going to keep it really short. The bottom line is that archival material is created by people who can read and write. And that means for centuries, the only records that were created by the elite, those with wealth and power. Throughout our history, archival repositories traditionally valued material that was created by the people who did things. So again, those with wealth and power. It's important for researchers to understand first what was not created at all, as well as the stuff that was created, if it was created, and was not deemed valuable enough to save. It's rare to find narratives of enslaved people, farmhands, factory workers, even though those individuals made up a huge proportion of the population. Women are very much underrepresented in many repositories. Again, I go back to the idea that a researcher needs to be a detective. The stories of those of the voiceless are often told by the people with wealth and power, but the researcher will need to hunt for those stories, and they'll also need to be very aware of the biases. In more recent days, happily, these problems are less of an issue. Literacy rates mean that nearly everyone creates archival material throughout their day-to-day lives. Further, almost every archival repository now works really hard to collect materials of underrepresented communities and marginalized peoples. But that does not mean that everybody's archival material becomes an archival collection for researchers to use. And probably the most common reason that collections don't make it to an archives is that family faced with cleaning out houses after relatives die or downsize simply don't think to save material or don't know what to do with it. In the end, when we look at all the ways that collections are not created or could be destroyed, I find it shocking that so many collections exist. And in fact, there are so many collections that exist. One such example is the Gordon A. Wilson Notes and Papers related to the works of William Romaine Newbold. This collection tells the story of a translation of Aristotle's Metaphysics that was never published. William Romaine Newbold was born in 1865 and was a professor of philosophy at Penn. If you've ever heard of him, you probably connect him with the Voynich manuscript, which is a famous coded text believed to have been written by Roger Bacon. Newbold was an early decoder, but his analysis has since been completely dismissed by scholars. He also translated a fair number of works by Aristotle, and when he died in 1926, he was in the midst of translating Aristotle's Metaphysics. Before he died, though, he gave his manuscript to one of his students, Henry Burr Alexander, who in turn gave the material to one of his students, Gordon A. Wilson. It is unclear to me whether this was a gift or a burden, but Wilson, along with a team of colleagues, worked on this manuscript until 1970, when Wilson was told by University of Pennsylvania professor of philosophy Charles Kahn that no amount of editing would really succeed in making it publishable. So 44 years of work on an unpublishable manuscript. How many times and how easily could this have been tossed in the trash and forgotten? Wilson died in 1974, and the manuscript was sent to Hartley Burr Alexander's son, Dr. Hubert Alexander, who for some unknown reason kept it. His son, Thomas Alexander, gifted it to Penn in 2008, and now it is happily available to researchers. So to recap, archival collections are a sticky web of complications from creation to deposit at a repository, and researchers need to be detectives to find all the clues available. But before a researcher can do their detective work, the collection has to be processed. Processing is what archivists do to make collections usable for researchers. Collections arrive at libraries, historical societies, museums, etc. in a million different ways. They might be in folders or binders that the creator used, or they might be dumped into plastic bags, broken down liquor boxes, and they can range in size from a handful of papers to hundreds of boxes. Regardless of topic, size, and order, it is the job of a processing archivist to determine a logical order, maintaining whenever possible the creator's own order. The archivist groups material together into series, which is archives jargon for groups of material, and this is called intellectual order. They then physically arrange material in that order as much as possible and make sure the collection is placed in boxes and folders so that it's safe to use and that the rate of deterioration is as slow as possible. After coming up with the collection level structure, there's a lot of alphabetization, putting items into chronological order and trying to come up with descriptions that actually mean something, unlike this post-it identifying material as various Chinese research in a collection of material relating to Chinese research. Then an archivist creates a document called a finding aid in which they describe the person, family, business, or organization, as well as the contents of the collection. The finding aid is published largely online these days, and researchers then have access to the collection. I've made this sound like a quick process, but depending on the size and complexity of a collection, it can take months to years to take a collection from its original state to being ready for researchers. Keep in mind that every collection is unique. Therefore, the archivist must approach each collection uniquely. We have best practices and general guidelines, but what works for one collection will not necessarily work for any other collection. So let's talk about finding aids. So I like to think of finding aids as maps to the collections. In essence, finding aids are big outlines with contextualizing information. Archivists arrange collections in hierarchical manner, and finding aids, for the most part, follow that arrangement. The contextualizing information provides the researcher with who created the collection, how big it is, what or who it's about, and broadly what kind of stuff you're going to find in the collection. It will also tell you where that collection lives and if there are any restrictions on material that you might want to use. The container list, which is the meat of the outline, describes in more detail the stuff within the collection, usually arranged in series, again, groups of material that may be delineated by types of material such as correspondence, diaries, financial records, or school records, by timeframes such as youth and early education, college education, career and retirement, by committees or departments within businesses or organizations, or even family members within large multi-generational family collections. Again, remember that archival material is unique, so no two finding aids will be the same. Archivists follow standards, and for the most part, finding aids should contain the same elements and they should be structured in very similar ways. Therefore, if you can use a finding aid at Penn, just say, you should be able to use finding aids at almost every repository across the country. One more thing to keep in mind is that archivists are required to present information objectively. It is the researcher's job to interpret the material, so finding aids are often sparse in colorful language and other stories that might change the way a researcher looks at the topic or the creator of the collection. So we'll look at a finding aid in detail, and we'll use the Wilson papers to do that. The first part of a collection should always be summary information. Here you will see where the collection is held, who created it, when it dates from, and you'll see how big it is. The summary also tells you in roughly 2 sentences who or what this collection is about, and very broadly what kind of stuff you're going to find in the collection. This is a really important little tiny section. From this section, you should know at the highest level if you want to use this collection. If you were looking for Newbold material from his early college days, you're not going to find it in this collection. If you were looking for a physicist named Gordon A. Wilson, again, this is the wrong collection. But let's say you do want to use this collection. 1.5 feet is pretty manageable. In 2 or 3 days, you could probably look at every single item in the collection. But that would be a very different story if the collection was 60 or 70 linear feet of material. Then you would almost certainly need to select components of the collection to look at, and the more certain you are of those components before you visit a reading room, the more effective your research will be. Moving through the finding aid, you will see the biographical and historical note. Archivists are not biographers, but it is our job to make sure that when information is available, that researchers know whether this collection will provide them with the answers they are looking for. So for example, if we were writing about Abraham Lincoln, we don't need to write a full biography of him, but maybe we want to focus on the parts that are represented in the collection. In this case, you're going to get some basic information on both Newbold and Wilson, birth and death dates, where they were educated, where they taught, and what their major accomplishments were. And in this case, how are the two related? Understanding the creator is important. We go back to context, because if you don't understand who the person was and what they did, it's difficult to understand why they produced their papery or electronic documentation and how that documentation is meaningful. The next question is, what kind of stuff is in this collection? For that info, you will look at the scope and content note, which tells you how the collection is arranged, in this case in 3 series or groups, as well as what types of documents and the general subject matter of the material. So if you know lots about William Romaine Newbold and had read that he kept a diary documenting his college year, you would know from reading this note that the collection most certainly does not contain that diary. That being said, notes, especially for larger collections, are necessarily summaries of material, so you should always look at the container list just to be sure. Administrative information is next, and the most important thing to note here is if any material is restricted. Most repositories try really hard not to restrict material, but by law, archivists are required to restrict personally identifiable information like social security numbers, medical records, and school records of living people. On top of the required restrictions, sometimes donors apply restrictions to their collections for a short period of time. Make sure you know what, if anything, is restricted before making a trip to a repository to look at things that you can't look at. Although you should always make sure to talk to someone before you give up, because sometimes there are ways to simply redact the personally identifiable information and still use the material. Make sure you note also if the archivist has provided related archival material. If what you're looking for isn't in this collection, you might be able to look at collections that the archivist has already identified for you. Controlled access headings or name and subject headings could be viewed a little bit like tags. They should ideally tell you at its most basic what topics and types of material you're going to find in this collection. Here you'll see that this collection is very generally about philosophy, education, and Aristotle. You'll also see that you'll be finding correspondence, letters, manuscripts being prepared for publishing, and translations of material. Keep in mind that these are a few terms that reflect the bulk of the material. Not every single thing mentioned in the collection is also going to be represented here. So finally, you'll get to the stuff, the meat of the collection. The container tells you what is in boxes and folders, and ideally keeps things together within series, groups of material, or at finer details in folders. Materials within series should be logically organized and should indicate the dates of the material contained within each folder. And if there are no dates, it should be indicated that the material is undated. In electronic finding aids, you can do keyword searching, but if you find something that interests you, make sure to look at material within that series. It is often connected, and depending on terminology used, you might not have gotten to the right thing just by keyword searching. So a good finding aid is a deliberate finding aid. The structure of the title and nearly every word in the description should have been carefully crafted by the archivist to accurately describe material, anticipate use, and make the collection as discoverable as possible. We know that finding aids will rarely be read in full from title to the end of the container list. Instead, we anticipate Google and keyword searching. Therefore, when a collection is completed, we should have thought about all the ways that people might use the collection, what words would guide them to accurately to the contents, and words that we should have used and don't mean that collection might be missed. Processing archivists, in my opinion, have the absolute best job in the world, but we definitely have our challenges. Our goals are first, to make as many collections as possible accessible to researchers. Second, to make it so that a researcher knows if the collection contains the information that they need. And third, to do so as objectively as possible. I will tell you plainly that as archivists, we rarely achieve all of these goals. The level of detail in processing and in a finding aid is very much dependent upon a repository's resources. And it's pretty fair to say that across the board, repositories of archival collections are generally under-resourced. It is time intensive and therefore expensive to process archival collections. And as a result, nearly all repositories have unprocessed backlog, and collections are almost always processed with less detail than either the research or the archivist might like. So most archivists focus on the first goal, to make as many archival collections accessible to researchers as possible. To do that, the second goal is almost always compromised despite all our best efforts. In order to make all collections available, we process less intensively. In other words, we cannot go to the level of detail that researchers or even we may want. What this means is that you as a researcher may have to work harder, and you may have to look through larger amounts of material within the collection to find the exact thing that you're looking at. You find the exact thing that you want. You almost certainly need to visit a reading room and comb through boxes. However, because we focus on the first goal to process as many collections as possible, it will mean that more collections are discoverable. An unprocessed collection is usually completely hidden to researchers. So I might say that having to visit an archives in person is the silver lining to that. There's nothing like handling archival material in person. And because of the context that is inherent in archival collections, you may find material that you never expected to find. Using an archival collection is often like walking in the shoes of the creator, and the path they take you on may be more rewarding than the one you planned. Before you actually visit, get in touch with the repository holding the collection and ask questions. Archivists and reading room staff want to help you, and they may be able to provide guidance before you make a trip halfway across the country. That's it. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly. That was wonderful. I think we're going to open it up now for questions anyone might have about how archives are organized, how they can be used, any of those things. So just feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Christine.
Just curious how trips to archives in person have changed at all during the pandemic, and what kinds of ways people are able to engage with these materials if they're able to engage with them, notwithstanding not being able to be there in person.
So actually, if that's okay, I'd like to pass that off to my colleague, Joan, who is in charge of the reading room. And one of the things that is unique to larger university archives and special collections is that I'm a technical services person, so I don't actually work in the reading room. So I'll hand that over to Joan.
Okay, thank you, Holly. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the question. I'll answer it somewhat generally and briefly. It'll save me 2 minutes in my own talk because I was going to circle back to that, and we can use those 2 minutes for something else. As all of you know, I'm sure many collections have been either completely or partially closed over the last 2 years, and it's a kind of complicated reopening and very, very individualized. It is really hard to know what any particular archive is doing week to week, and that increases the burden on all of us of checking in advance. There really is no other way to say it except there's no governing body except for local authorities that tell libraries and archives how to handle patrons, what hours to be open, and other kinds of health guidelines. So things have really been up in the air a lot. There are cases, and this may help some of you, when libraries, certainly including ours, but not only, have been able to offer digitization, that is to say, the scanning of original documents as a substitute for visiting. That's not true everywhere. Not all places have the resources to do it. But in many cases, libraries can at least partially scan things for you. So I'm sure we'll all say this many times, it's okay to send an email. It's okay to send a second email if you don't get an answer to the first one. It's okay to pick up the phone and try to talk to someone at the place you're hoping to visit. In fact, it really becomes pretty necessary to do it, just because even a website, the information on a website may really not necessarily be entirely up to date. And the last thing anyone wants is for someone to take a trip. It's happened, and be disappointed at the outcome because some rules have changed, or they didn't have access to the stuff they thought they were going to see. So it's a pretty vague answer, but things have really been up in the air with lots of unfortunate closures and setbacks. So we're hoping we're getting to a different place. I'll turn it now maybe over to Joanna.
Actually, I think it was Amina who was first.
Sorry, Amina, go ahead. Apologies.
Hi, thank you for putting this on. I have a question, something that has been a problem for me doing archival work. How do you navigate things that are published anonymously across different collections, and if you can give some tips on that.
Great question.
Yeah. So I think that that is a really incredibly challenging thing that you would have to do. I will say that archivists, when they are able to find that anonymous, like the actual anonymous, if they can figure out who it was, they would note that. But I think that that then becomes much more a burden on the researcher, in that they have to sort of understand where those anonymous things might end up and be looking very carefully. So I think, again, I might not be the right person to answer this. This might be a Lynne and John question, because again, I'm the processor, not the reference person. But I would say that as an archivist, we would work very hard to highlight that sort of thing, but we don't always process the same. There's a team of us. So one collection that would be processed by me, the collection that has a similar thing might be processed by a different archivist. And that makes it harder for us to sort of be aware of all of the similarities. So,
And
Yep.
what period can maybe we can make this a little bit of a dialogue. I mean, what period do you work in? And I maybe, can you share any examples? I mean, anonymity, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. It's a really interesting problem in the sort of early modern space, but tell us more about what you've run into.
So right now I'm looking at pamphlets during the English Civil War, and political pamphlets after Restoration.
Yeah.
And it's unclear.
All
sometimes.
anonymous, all
Yeah,
anonymous,
all
right?
anonymous,
Right.
given
Right.
the
There are
type
no
of
authors in your world. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And trying to sort out the political debates and who's actually writing and the role women had in on those debates.
And sometimes you have to work with the printers, where you have information on the printers. You have to use that as a way, as your inroad, to try to figure out who might be behind certain things. I mean, it's difficult. It's very difficult, but the people who are printing or selling will also, often be part of these networks. And in those networks, you may be able to discover things. There could be correspondence and other things that would help lead you to some kinds of discoveries around these.
Yeah, and maybe the questions that you develop can't always be about the author. Maybe one has to work with different kinds of circles and networks and attributions that can avoid the assigning of a final author, when in fact people have struggled often for generations to do that. I don't know if Joan's audio is working. Joan has worked a lot on this problem in early modern France, and it's.
If I can unmute, can you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can, Joe.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
This is unstable at best. I will say this, that I was thinking about this actively as you guys were beginning to talk, and I'd say there are only two things I know of. One, the National Library holding the collection. If librarians there have not made any attribution, it's highly unlikely that it can be done with any certainty. I've worked a roughly similar period, the Civil War in Paris, 1659 to 1663. And some of those pamphlets have been attributed, but they've been attributed by scholars, and the attributions are up online. Most of them are anonymous, and anonymous for good reason. It was dangerous work, and people don't want their names attached to it. And I don't think you can penetrate beyond this. Occasionally, I would contact the national libraries, because sometimes there are researchers from those libraries, archivists like the people here, who are working on these collections, and they might have some information they have not yet put forward. But that's about my only suggestion for progress. Sorry about that. It's an anonymous world.
Thank you.
Sometimes too, the other place you can find things is there may be other texts out there where they actually do identify people because they're trying to get them out. So sometimes people are outed, authors are outed. And that's another place where you will sometimes be able to identify, if not the author, at least have a good sense of who might be behind a particular pamphlet or something of that nature, because somebody else has made about this thing, and then they know who it came from, and they're then putting that name out there.
Another point that Lynn made quickly, but is pretty important, and maybe for a number of you, is that we tend not to pay too much attention to the printers of things. But if you're working with any kind of printed documents, and most early modernists are, printers really matter. And not only do printers know authors, sometimes printers are authors. And we might be able to identify a printing network which can tell us a lot about authorship or politics, even if we may never get to the exact author in the sort of modern sense.
Well, there may not have been an exact single.
And there may never have been one. Yeah.
Sometimes these are written collectively too.
Right.
That's the other thing you need to keep in mind, that sometimes it's a group of people writing something, somebody might have drafted and other people, are contributing to it. But great question,
That's
really
a
great
great
question. Johanna? Did you have a question? Maybe not. Are there any other questions before we take a short break? Yes, Amanda.
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, because I'm working with both Belgian and French and American feminism, and I was wondering if there's any like databases or finding aids, as I just learned that it's called, that are cross-cultural or cross-language, cross-nation borders. I know that normally there's databases nationally, but I was wondering if there's any like transnational connection here. Thank you.
So I'll start with that, but I think again, lots of other people might want to hop in. So I don't know if you're familiar with Europeana, which is a really amazing European network of collections and material. So that would be one that I think would work really well for you. In the US, it's a really, really difficult for researchers to find out where collections are. So I would say that the best thing that you can do is Google search with the name of your person followed by papers, or the name of your organization followed by records in quotes. That should get you away from just finding everything there is to know about that person or the company and get you specifically to archival records. But it is an incredibly, we've made it very difficult for researchers. So right now we're in the process of creating a national finding aid site, which would be amazing, but we're not there yet. So I will open this up to anyone else who would like to share on that, because I think as researchers, you probably have very different methods for finding these things across countries.
Well, maybe we can think about answers to that question and come back to it later. I think we should take a short break and come back at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So I will see you then.
Thanks, Holly. That was great. Really excellent. Thanks so much.
I see a very young philosopher there just a second ago, looking on.
He's a little noisy, so we're gonna stay muted.
You're supposed to make noise. Noise in the archives. It's okay.
Lynn, you're muted.
Sorry. I was just saying that if you're having issues with your internet and you have a question, just put it in the chat. That's fine. I'm going to start up with the second hour. I'm just going to introduce John Pollack. He's curator for research services in the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. And among other duties, he assists researchers, organizes class sessions, and manages the Furnace Shakespeare Library. He holds a PhD in English from Penn and specializes in early modern and early American literatures, with a particular focus on the American colonial period and Native America. John? And he's going to speak on working in archives and special collections libraries.
Right, which is a bit of a way of saying an ongoing conversation that we just began in the last hour. So thanks to all of you for being here today, and we wish we were in person, but we hope we can make this part of an ongoing set of conversations as we learn more about your work, and do our best to help you and engage with you in it. I'm going to be as brief as I can, but in summary, I'm going to try to talk about things in two parts: how to find it, or maybe part two, at Holly being part one of how to find it. And then the second topic I'll touch on briefly is, once you find it, how do you use it? Some of the basic overviews of working in special collections and archives, which are not usually designed as daunting or overbearing places, but can sometimes feel that way, off-putting even. And we'd like to help lower those barriers and make it so that you all can be discoverers in archival and special collections. There is an interesting paradox, I think, at the root of some of the projects you all are doing, which is this assignment that someone might get or give to students, or we might give it to our own students: go discover someone whom no one has written about, go find an unknown philosopher. And put that way, the task can seem impossible. It really raises some larger questions, I think, about how we make discoveries in the humanities. And we, in many cases, or maybe all cases, have to make our discoveries by following known paths, following up on leads that others may have traced, if inadequately. And to do that, we often need to learn the coded language, not only of our own disciplines, many of you I'm imagining, but not all of you in philosophy, our own disciplines, but also the languages of those who organize and categorize, which is to say, of course, librarians and archivists. Not only do we need to learn the codes and categories they use now, and you heard some of this from Holly just a moment ago, but we also need to learn the codes and categories used in earlier generations, and other times and in other places. So much of library and archival work is additive, which is to say, cataloged items are rarely recatalogued, and libraries are full of materials whose cataloging and descriptions were done by earlier hands, earlier generations, using varied and varying standards and methodologies. This is an obvious point, but Holly's methods, for example, differ from her predecessors, often by a lot in many cases. I'm going to try to sort of maybe talk about some of these general points with some specific examples, mainly from early modern Europe, completely, and mainly from England. although you see on my title slide here, a French manuscript from the early 18th century, which I'll come back to in 1 second. It's a truism, but maybe worth stating that when we use online catalogs, we can only really find what our catalogs allow us to find. Our metadata, to use the contemporary term, the information about the books and manuscripts we're trying to find. Here, for example, is just a screenshot with the subject heading Women Philosophers. That's a very recent subject heading. It's pretty vague in itself. In our own local catalog at the University of Pennsylvania, it turns up surprisingly few hits, not in zero, and it's actually a good starting point, but one has to both use and be very skeptical of these kinds of subject headings. I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but I'll say it anyway. The problem gets even greater when we talk about the word philosophy itself, particularly for you early modernists. Philosophy covers potentially everything in the early modern period, especially if we include natural as well as moral philosophy. At the same time, and maybe even because of this, early modern books, early modern materials are rarely cataloged with that word used at all. So philosophy is both ubiquitous and to some extent, I think, invisible. We were talking a second ago about the problem of authorship, and I'd like to say a few more words about it, the risk of being too repetitive here. Anonymity and pseudonymity is a way of working, a way of writing in early modern Europe, and we can't avoid it. We need to understand it. Here, for example, is a manuscript with no attributed author, no named figures at all, on philosophy and philosophers. We have a rough date, and we have a description that is a very brief summary in which we've simply highlighted some of the named figures in the manuscript itself, Aristotle, Descartes, you can see there, which is to say that finding this document in any online catalog involves requiring a series of known clues in order to find an unattributed text. Yes, you might want to use Descartes as a keyword because so many authors might have been responding to Descartes, even if Descartes is not your subject, even if you're hoping to find texts that address topics only tangentially related to Descartes. Here, the keyword term author name Descartes might turn up something anonymous. And Lynne used an example like this a second ago, but it's a really prevalent issue in early modern texts. This is a case of a text attributed to a lady, written by a lady, you can see in the middle of the title page. Modern scholars have attributed to Mary Astle, but there's no such author claim anywhere in this work. An essay in defense of the female sex, printed in London in 1696. Now people think this is Mary Astle. How many other texts written by a lady in the 17th and 18th centuries might be, well, as here a woman author clearly, might be works that philosophy needs to think about. So one can start to even take author claims as a way of searching. We might not be able to find a named author, but we might be able to find works, quote unquote, written by a lady. Authorship can get extremely complicated and could be the subject of an entire seminar for all of you. But just to make a couple of more points on this, to the Latin and English editions, I should say, of Anne Conway's Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy. Well, where is Anne Conway in these printed works. Nowhere named except, and I included this in my photograph because I thought it was worth showing to you, in a 19th century hand on the English edition to your right that has identified her there. But even within our own library, these two works are cataloged differently, and Anne Conway is only mentioned in a note, not even assigned as an author. The only named author that we see at all in the English edition is someone named J.C., who we think was actually the translator, someone named Kroll, whom I know nothing about. So a text like this is not only an interesting work of quote unquote philosophy, but presents some really tangled issues of authorship and attribution that can sometimes defy catalogs. And I should also say that different libraries may very well describe this book in different ways, some naming Conway because she's now known or thought to be one of the authors, others perhaps leaving her aside completely. Lynne mentioned this quickly as well, but we might want to think in the early modern context again about genres that we might say hide philosophy. Here, Margaret Cavendish's works, Cavendish's plays. She's a literary author, quote unquote, most popular in her own moment for drama. Not necessarily part of the philosophical canon in modern times, but her plays arguably should be work that people working on early modern philosophy might very well want to take into account. I've pasted in the catalog record, though, to show you that in no way will you find a text like this using a search term like philosophy. It's not there at all. And obviously, these are figures about whom we know something already. We'll turn to in a second to the problem of people we know almost nothing about. I should say also, and this is a point that has to do with the importance of looking at copies of books, sometimes looking at multiple copies of the same book. A scholar named Liza Blake at the University of Toronto works on Cavendish and has actually been able to demonstrate by looking at every copy that she can find of these plays and other Cavendish publications that Cavendish was interacting with her printers and changing her editions in a short period of time, literally changing their texts. And she would only have been able to discover this by looking at, quote unquote, the same book across multiple collections. So especially for you early modernists, it's often very worth calling up a similar text in different collections. Holly touched on this a little bit, but I thought I'd like to mention quickly the question of what an archive is. It can mean a lot of things, and it can mean a lot of things, particularly for early modernists. It can mean collections of print. Everything I've shown you so far, with the exception of that French manuscript, is a published or printed work. But we often need to think of the print archive when we're looking at early modern studies. Letters, often the letters that we have may often be printed letters, not just handwritten or manuscript letters. John Norris or the assigned author of this text is John Norris, Letters Concerning the Love of God, London, 1695. But the letters to Norris that are printed in this edition are written by Mary Astell. Astell, again, sometimes credited, sometimes not. So this is not just John Norris's work, and one could call this in a way a kind of archive of Mary Astell's letters, though printed. In many cases, printed letters do not have corresponding versions in archives. That is to say, we don't always have, or often we do not have, the handwritten versions of such letters. So this is a kind of archival research using print materials that is very important for early modernists to do. Mary Astell starts with this great line: "Though some morose gentleman would perhaps remit me to the distaff or the kitchen, or at least to the glass and the needle, the proper employments as they fancy of a woman's life, yet expecting better things from the more equitable and ingenious Mr. Norris, who is not so narrow-souled as to confine learning to his own sex or to envy it in ours, I presume to beg his attention a little to the impertinencies of a woman's pen. Great opening there. That's Mary Astle. Mary Astle, again, only signing M.A. in a printed preface to a 1783 edition of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's letter. So this is an edition printed after Astle's life, but including a text by her. So one can see the importance in this case of looking at later editions as well. Pre-modern archives can have multiple organizations. They can include printed books. They can include individually cataloged or bound or codex manuscripts. They can include archives or family papers of the kind Holly was talking about, manuscript collections of that kind. These kinds of organizations can differ nationally, and they can differ even from institution to institution within a country. A university research library and a historical society, for example, even if they're in the same city, might have very different ways of categorizing and cataloging similar materials. So we need to become cognizant of this library lingo, organizational methodologies, and search terms. And we need to look closely and get familiar with material texts and material culture, how title pages looked, how print worked, the information they hide or include. On the top left of this image, you see a little note, I think that might say her book. I can't be sure about that, a little scratch note. Provenance, ownership. The people who owned and wrote, in some cases, in their books may be as important to our work as the people who authored them. So let's talk quickly now, without taking too much more time, about specific ways and means of finding things. I should almost skip over this slide because Holly's just told you how problematic it is to search across archival collections and across countries. This is, though, something called Archive Grid. It represents a kind of rudimentary attempt to provide archival searching of manuscript collections or archives across mainly North American libraries and archives. It's a subscription database, so not all of your institutions may have it. And as Holly was suggesting, our frenemy Google may in some cases may be more effective. We could maybe ask Holly for her comments on Archive Grid at some point. But it's also worth pointing out that individual libraries have often over time created their own catalogs and guides. Some cases those catalogs are in print or were in print and may still be the most important way to understand something about a specific collection, a specific library, a specific holding within a library. So be aware that the Beinecke Library at Yale has many individual guides to their own collections. Maybe they're listed on their websites, maybe they're things that were printed 20 or 30 years ago and may still be crucial tools. Similarly, the European archives and really all collections heavily invested in print 20 or 30 or 50 years ago as a way of describing collections, and we still need those older guides. Finding aids are one place, but not the only place by any means. Another thing I'd like to just say quickly to emphasize, we've said it before, is conversation. It's okay to write to libraries. It's actually a good thing. Librarians and archivists like to know what their researchers are looking for, and most of us try to be helpful. So an initial contact, a question about your research is not only acceptable, it's often welcome. People can think about your work and contribute ideas to it. The best scholars, I think, are often the ones who are engaging as much as possible in conversation with the librarians and archivists they're trying to work with. We can, of course, use other sources as a way to get to the archives. We shouldn't underestimate things like biographical dictionaries, the old, quote unquote, old fashioned, but now digital Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, Anne Conway's article here. Obviously, maintains its focus on the famous figures, but always includes at the end of articles like the one on Anne Conway, lists of archival collections that may have been consulted. There's a language here. You may not know that PRO stands for the Public Records Office or HUNT for the Huntington Library. We have to learn these languages, but biographical dictionaries can actually be an important way in, starting point to the quote unquote archive, the massive, sense of where would I possibly go? So don't ignore that. Don't ignore also, I would say, I may sound like a professor in a first year grad seminar, the role of new scholarship in pointing us to old materials. You may spend more of your time reading the footnotes and bibliographies of articles and books now than you do the texts themselves, because those will give you the clues to archival paths others have followed and that you might want to consider following yourself. So pay attention to new scholarship, even a new biographical encyclopedia of early modern English women like this with a lot of short articles may provide great clues and new starting points for new work. And as Lynn mentioned before, libraries of primary sources like the early modern English woman and some of these publication projects that have gone on since, in some cases, since the 1970s to bring new primary sources to light can also point you to new archival sources. Very quickly, once you find it, how do you use it? Well, working in a reading room can, as we said a few minutes ago, seem a little daunting. Hours can be limited. Requests usually almost always need to be made in advance, and in advance can mean at least 24 hours, often days or even more in advance. So planning ahead is really crucial. Conversation and contact as best you can is absolutely vital, particularly, as we said before, in our COVID era. There are rules and regulations in these places. A friend of mine likes to joke that every library has just enough differences in the way that they ask special collections to be handled, so that some librarian has to come up to you and tell you, you're not doing it right. But generally speaking, those rules of handling are designed to protect and preserve materials, and you have to be cognizant of them. Bringing in only a limited amount of things with you, a laptop, usually a phone is allowed nowadays, taking notes in pencil, those kinds of things. I'm happy to say that most libraries now allow digital photography, but that is still in the process of changing. So I advise you to check on digital photography policies before you arrive so that you don't make a faux pas in that area. And finally, digitization requests. If you can't take photographs yourself, will libraries scan things for you? The answer is often they will, and in some cases there may be costs to those things, but it's helpful to inquire. Yes, there is no substitute for visiting things in person. You always make discoveries live that are really hard to do using some of the tools we were just looking at. But it is, digitization of collections now. Many larger libraries are equipped with facilities to do this. So if you can't do it yourself, and sometimes if you have the funds to support you, you should certainly ask about having things scanned for you. So that's a brief overview, and I'm going to turn it over to Christine.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
And while you're doing that, I'm just going to mention, Christine, that you serve as the inaugural Assistant General Counsel and Copyright Advisor at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries, coordinating support for copyright information policy and related scholarly communication activities on the Penn campus. And I could go on from there, but because we're running low on time, I'm going to move forward with Christine's presentation.
That's A-okay with me, because that's exactly who I am. Thank you very much to Lynn for that warm welcome. Can I ask if everybody can see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm thrilled to be here today to share a little bit of information with you about copyright considerations for your research and scholarship activities. Copyright comes up a lot during the research process, even if you might not appreciate it. And here are a few examples of how copyright questions have impacted publishing activities within our community here at the Penn Library. Many times, the scholar may not begin to think about these types of questions unless and until their publisher flags them right about as they're about to go to print. This can set you on a panic scramble to find the right information that you might need or figure out how to get in contact with the right people to seek permission to reproduce work that might not belong to you. Publishers can also take a lot of different approaches to these questions, and some gray areas do exist. And so my goal today is to give you some food for thought about how you might think about answering some of these questions and what documentation you might want to collect during the course of your research to make your life a little bit easier on the back end. Before we dive right in, I wanted to give you the caveat portion of this presentation, which is I am a lawyer that's licensed to practice the law in the United States, but the information that I'm sharing with you today is meant for educational purposes only. And I'm going to be focusing on US law and cultural norms here today around copyright and reuse. But just to let you know that copyright laws and customs can and do vary greatly from country to country. With that in mind, if you're completing research outside of the United States or you're publishing your work outside of the United States, you should take some time to make yourself aware of copyright and permission culture within that particular country to save yourself from a little bit of grief. And you might need to seek the advice of a local professional for guidance on how to navigate that meaningfully in your own particular world. So with those caveats in place, probably starting at the most basic level, what is a copyright? A copyright is a form of intellectual property, and it protects creative works of authorship that are fixed in a tangible medium of expression. So in plain old English, that means once a writer puts a pen to a piece of paper and writes something that's original to them, the copyright in that work belongs to them. And the Copyright Act uses the word author to describe all types of creators, from people who paint paintings to people who write books to people who write songs. So copyrights can pop up in all kinds of things that you might be using within your archival materials, like books, manuscripts, images, journal articles, dissertations, diaries, and letters. And those copyrights may be existing or might have expired with the passage of time, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So what good is a copyright? A copyright owner has basically 6 exclusive rights, meaning they can stop other people from doing these particular things if they are a copyright owner. One of those things is they can stop other people from making copies of their work. They can stop other people from sharing copies of their work. They can control how their work is displayed publicly. If it's a song or a play, they can control how people perform the work publicly. They can control the way that others make works that are based on their work, such as adaptations or translations into a foreign language. And in the case of a song, they can control the way that it's performed over something like the radio. But, this feels a little bit harsh that one copyright owner would be able to control the way that someone is able to use all of this work indefinitely. And so that's why copyright, at least in the United States and in most countries, is time limited. After a period of time, it expires. So currently in the United States, copyright will last for the life of the author plus 70 years. And after that particular copyright expires, it enters something called the public domain, making it free for others to use without seeking any kind of permission. Also, there are a number of exceptions built into the United States copyright laws that allows for uses of work without seeking permission. And the most famous one, I think, that we all might have heard of is something called fair use, which allows you to reuse limited portions of in-copyright material for certain prescribed purposes without having to seek permission of the copyright holder, even if the copyright is still alive and in place. So since you're all students and scholars of philosophy, I kind of wanted to set this up for you as a thought exercise. copyright is a series of balances. On one end, we have the rights of the creator of creative materials, who we want to encourage to build things and create things and share their work. We want to give them the opportunity to monetize their particular work or enjoy having control over it for a prescribed period of time. And on the other hand, we as a society really find building upon this material, creating new works and sharing new discoveries with the public is something that we really want to encourage. So the 2 points are kind of balanced against each other, and different countries can take different perspectives on how to strike this particular balance. For example, in the United States, like I mentioned, we have something called fair use, which is a very expansive right and very flexible, whereas other countries might not have something like fair use written into their laws. On the other hand, countries like France recognize greater things within copyright than we do here in the United States. For example, they recognize to a greater extent something called the moral rights of authorship than we have here in the US. So I'm setting it up for you as a thought exercise because I think it's kind of interesting to think of copyright as both a shield and a sword, because you're both a creator and a content user. And I wanted to flag that sometimes scholars can come to different conclusions about what they can do under the law versus the moral compass that kind of guides their practice more generally. So with that as kind of our philosophical background, I wanted to kind of mention a couple of traps for the unwary that you might not be aware of. And one of the things that I think bears a little bit of explanation is something that new scholars of copyright, have a hard time parsing out, which is that ownership of a physical object does not necessarily transfer any copyright rights with it. So while a repository can have a copy of a book or a manuscript you might need to consult, they're not necessarily the copyright holder of that particular work, and they might not have rights to grant you, even if you ask nicely. So in the United States, transfer of copyright requires a written affirmative grant of rights from the initial copyright holder. Some archives can affirmatively tell you, for example, through a finding aid, what rights it does or does not have. Others don't have that information readily available, so you might have to do a little bit of sleuthing and detective work. The moral here is that you should read any repository use, copyright, or reproduction policies very carefully, because they can have guidance for you on what they do and do not own from a copyright perspective. And they might also have some information for you about how to appropriately cite the work within the collection, within your scholarship. Some may even require a fee, like John mentioned, to digitize things for you or to provide you copies of things. You're not going to know unless you look at those policies or if you ask those questions. If you have any questions about what those do mean, if you find a policy and you're not really sure what rights it encompasses, like John also mentioned, ask. People are always willing to share information with you to the extent that they have it. Another thing that I wanted to touch upon is that currently in the United States, post-1977, there are no magic words an author needs to say or any formalities that the author needs to follow to protect their copyright interest. They don't have to register the work with the Copyright Office. They don't have to put a C in a circle on it to protect their copyright interest. This is new. It wasn't always the case. In the past, if you didn't put a C in a circle on your work, you didn't register it with the Copyright Office, you didn't follow the appropriate formalities of renewal and registration, your copyright could fall into the public domain. So it requires a little bit of detective work and sleuthing to figure out if the work that you want to use is within the public domain. And I've included some resources on the last slide to help you do some of those calculations. Sometimes it takes a little bit of research because the rules have changed, and you want to be careful because you're going to have to be doing a little bit of math. As a broad general rule in the United States, at the very least, materials published or unpublished before 1902 are all in the public domain. Materials lawfully first published before 1927, I believe, are also in the public domain, and works created after 1977 are all likely still under copyright. Anything kind of in between those dates, you're going to have to do a little bit of diligence to figure out, what the copyright status of that work might be. And I mentioned briefly that copyright law does distinguish between published and unpublished materials when determining, what how much of a work that you might be able to use under something like fair use. So I wanted to talk about that perhaps in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So when I say published or unpublished, I'm thinking about it in terms of what the Copyright Act describes as published. And so what does it mean for a work to be unpublished? It's basically a term of art. It's considered unpublished if the work was not intended for public distribution, or if only a few copies were created and distribution was limited. So think of a diary, personal papers, or personal letters. So a lot of the things that you might be working with in an archival collection. And I'm mentioning this to you because historically greater protection has been granted to the authors of unpublished materials, even looking at it through something like the lens of fair use, like we have here in the United States. So if you're going through a fair use assessment, one of the questions that you ask yourself is whether or not the work is unpublished, because there is kind of a historical philosophical gloss that an author should be able to control the way that their work was first published. So that's not to say that, always using unpublished works is always not a fair use, but, you might have to do a little bit of digging, and you might have to, limit the amount that you're using to make it more likely that your use is fair. If you're borrowing the heart or the most important piece of that unpublished work, something that might impact the privacy of the author, or something that might be a salacious or juicy bit, you might want to proceed with a little bit of caution when performing your assessment. I wanted to mention briefly here some of those repository use policies that we've been kind of talking about, and finding aids that might have information for you about copyright holders and who you might need to contact to seek permission for these types of things. Because sometimes a finding aid can include information about any kind of like donor restriction on the way that the material might be reused or published, because one of the famous cases here in the United States about publishing unpublished materials has to do with the unpublished letters of the author J.D. Salinger, which were held in two separate library archives across the United States. And both of those archives had use policies in place that prohibited the publishing of those works, outside of like personal scholarship purposes only. So if you're formally publishing it, you weren't supposed to do that, and you're supposed to seek separate permission. Someone wanted to publish a biography of the author, and so they went into those two libraries and they copied portions of those unpublished letters and then included them within the draft for their particular biography. Salinger found out about it and brought a lawsuit to try and stop the publication of that particular book. And while those use policies at those two libraries were not outcome determinative to the case, they really featured prominently and heavily. So make sure you ask questions, make sure you understand what you're able to do and not able to do, and seek additional information if you need it. So assuming that you need to ask permission, the use that you're making is not necessarily fair, or say your publisher requires you to have some kind of written permission in place before they'll allow you to move forward to publish, there's some general tips that I can give you to make that a little bit easier on yourself. And I think that the biggest overarching point I want to make is something that a lot of my colleagues keep bringing up, which is plan ahead. Make sure you ask and investigate what kind of information the repository has, whether there are any restrictions on how to use materials. Read what those policies are, and maybe check with the person coordinating your visit, if you can't easily find those policies, what their policies might be, and how you might go about finding out who the copyright owners of this material might be, if that's not entirely clear to you when you begin your research. Permissions can and do take a lot of time to do well. I typically tell people to budget about 3 months when they're thinking about how they want to navigate these different things. And make sure that you ask for permissions with enough time to follow up a couple of times if you need to, because a lot of the time, the staff you're working with have a lot of responsibilities, or the repository or archive might be understaffed because of the pandemic. So just know before you go that it might take some time to clear this stuff. And when framing your request, to the extent that you can, try and be as clear as you can about what it is that you're trying to find. how are you going to use this material? How are you going to republish it? The more detail you include, the better, because it helps someone evaluating your ask, who would necessarily be the person to send the request to, and the more information you provide, the easier you're making their job. So it's worth taking a minute to talk about Creative Commons licenses, because you might come across one within your research, put affirmatively on the materials that you want to use. And there are a number of different kinds of Creative Commons licenses. They're a standard set of licenses that a copyright holder can affix to their work, which would affirmatively grant permission to other people to use or reuse their content in certain ways. I've included a link to the Creative Commons website that has a lot of information about this if you want to look at what the individual licenses might mean. Point for a trap for the unwary is that they come in different flavors, and the licenses allow or disallow certain things. So if you want to do something that isn't allowed by that license that is affixed to the work, you're going to want to reach out to the copyright holder and ask permission for that different use. Another thing you might come across within a finding aid or within a use policy is something called a rights statement. And these are basically high-level summaries of what the copyright status is of a particular work that you might find. They are different from a license in that they are not an affirmative grant of permission. They're rather a summary of what information the repository might or might not have about the copyright status of that particular work. So if you see a rights statement affixed to a work, it's not an affirmative grant of permission, but it could help point you in the right direction of who you might need to talk to next to get permission to use a particular piece of material within a publication. And I frequently get asked, how do I go about finding a rights holder? There are a number of resources that can help you. John pointed to some when he was speaking. The front and back matter of a book or a published material sometimes has some contextual clues. For unpublished material, sometimes the finding aids for that collection will have great contextual clues. If you know who the author is, there are certain databases out there that can help you find out more information, such as Watch, which is a co-production between the University of Texas and the University of Reading. Lynne mentioned when she was speaking that sometimes it's good to go back to the original publisher of the book. Sometimes, the publisher of those materials might be defunct. There's a database called FOB, which also is put on by the University of Reading and the University of Texas, which kind of tracks what happened to a lot of defunct publishers and who was acquired by whom, which is sometimes helpful in completing your research journey. Separately, the United States Copyright Office has some of these records available, as well as guides for searching and finding rights holders as well. And then simply doing biographical research can sometimes get you pretty far. You might come across colleagues, former employers, family members of that particular person that you're studying, and sometimes they can point you to the representative of their estate or an attorney who represents their particular interests. So in closing, just a couple more tips and then we'll wrap it up. Basically be as specific as you can. The more details that you provide, the easier it is you're making it for the person answering your letter. Sometimes it's hard to figure out things from scratch. So the slides I have at the end include some templates and some resources for putting together like a permissions letter, if that's something that you need to be doing. And then kind of going back and highlighting a couple of things that some of my colleagues have said, which is, do your diligence, budget enough time, and don't be afraid to be a detective. Don't be afraid to ask. Oftentimes, just doing a little research on the website of the archive before you go, or sending an email before you go, can really set you on the road to success. I always say if you can't find like a use policy or a permissions policy on the website proper, try doing an internet search using the name of the repository and some of those buzzwords like permissions or copyright, and sometimes that'll pull up the right information for you. And to the extent that you're able to find this kind of material, or you get a license, or you get permission, or you correspond with the rights holder, always try and keep receipts for yourself, because your publisher might ask you for affirmative documentation that you've done your due diligence. So my other slides are simply lists of resources. So I'm going to wrap it up and open it back up.
I see there's already a question, Corey.
Thanks for that, Christine. I had a question that's maybe a bit mundane. So if I put in, I want to see a letter, or an archive holds a letter from an author from the 18th century. It's obviously not, it's obviously in the public domain at that point. And I request that it's digitized, that if a photo is made of it, and I pay for that. And they send it to me. Is it presumed that I'm allowed to use it, to post it on a website, for instance, or make other use of it? Or would it still require me, or is it still prudent for me to seek some sort of formal permission?
So that is not a mundane question at all. And it's actually a very, very good one. What you want to keep in mind in situations like that is, while there might not be a copyright holder, there might be a person with feelings. And so, sometimes being a good scholar means doing something that you might not be legally required to do, but something that might, be to your interest to do. So while you might not be under a legal obligation to seek any kind of permission from like the family or the particular estate of the copyright holder, if the material you're publishing about might, raise some kind of discomfort for a living person, you might be in a good position to, do your diligence, see if there's anyone still living that might be upset by the thing that you're writing about. That's not to say do or don't do it. It's just saying, be a good citizen of the world and know what might happen, if you post something that is particularly sensitive. And the other thing that I'm going to say is that sometimes the repository that you ask to provide you with information has these particular use policies in place that ask you to credit them in a certain way, or to point to, the fact that they're the people that hold that particular material. You're under no real legal requirement to do that. It's largely, like, from a copyright perspective, it's largely contractual based, right? But be a good citizen of that repository, because you might need to use, their resources in the future. They're providing a service to you. They're doing something. They're providing you materials. To the extent that they're asking you to attribute them, it's generally good scholarship and academic manners to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Jacqueline?
Thanks for that, Christine. I wrote in with this question, and I know that you are mainly an expert in US copyright law, but my question was about UK copyright, and I thought it'd be worth asking the question in light of Corey's question about different repositories. But so I am a researcher of 17th century women philosophers, and so my authors are long dead, 400 years old. And my question was to libraries, has usually just been, can I reproduce the material? Because they often have strictures on use of unpublished manuscripts, for example. And so to do due diligence, I would write and say, can I have permission to use the transcription in my publication? That was fine until a couple of years ago. And more recently, a colleague had the same difficulty. Libraries are refusing to grant permission on account of the British law concerning orphan copyright works, which means that unpublished materials, regardless of how long ago the author died, how many centuries ago they died, they would, the copyright, the work was still regarded as being in copyright if the author was unknown or their heirs were unknown. And so this has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. The orphan copyright law applies until 2039. I don't really have a question, just more of a kind of warning that the laws do seem to be different in the UK with regards to unpublished manuscripts without authors or without known heirs. So just a point to make there. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I wish I could speak to that in more detail, but it's something that I personally am not familiar with. John, did you have something to say?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point. I'm going to guess, although you know way more about it than I do, that different repositories in the UK are going to apply that law really differently. I mean, I don't think the British Library has closed down all citation from all pre-modern manuscripts, but it probably gets pretty sticky. It sounds like this is really stifled a lot of republication, you're saying. And
perhaps I should have added, you can add a disclaimer, and I think that's the way the British Library got around it, especially putting up the materials on their online databases, that they've got a disclaimer that they went to all reasonable efforts to locate descendants of the copyright holder and so on. So that's one way around it. I think my question to Christine was how do we get around this? And there have been some suggestions made by librarians to that effect.
Well, there isn't, I mean, there's something similar, Christine, for US copyright for things that are orphan works.
The US was not able to pass a law on orphan works, though they did try really hard in 2009 to do something about it. Now, in large part, you know, you have to go through and figure out whether or not the work is still under copyright based on, you know, the relative age of things. So if the work is, you know, unpublished, but from before 1902, we have no idea who the creator was, you know, here in the United States, it's probably going to be within the public domain because of the passage of time. So that's some comfort. And then for other things, you can only do the best that you can do and see how far your gut takes you on what the appropriate course of action would be. A lot of folks have different risk tolerances, and different publishers also have different guidelines in place to kind of guide you through some of those particular concerns. A lot of the time here with the United States publisher, you know, while fair use is alive and very well here in the United States, they might still say, you know, quotes over a certain amount, you still need written permission in order to include it. You know, you, author, are responsible for getting these particular permissions, even if the overall, you know, strictures of the law in the United States might permit you to do something a little bit more flexibly. So it's a give and take, and each case is, you know, slightly different.
yeah, I was going to say, I write a lot of permissions for things that I don't think need permission because a publisher has insisted that someone get something.
Yeah. Which is a bummer.
Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks. So this question is maybe for John, maybe for Holly. I was thinking about what you said about the attributing anonymous works, and if the archivist didn't manage to do it, it's going to be really hard to do. There's work I've been interested in that is, I think, wrongly attributed by the British Library to like the grandfather of the person who it should really be by. And the only person who writes about it also has it as written by the grandson. And I'm just curious about how to think about like the status of those attributions. Like, is there, would there be like a paper trail of how they decided to make that attribution? Or like, would that question be interesting to them, or would I just be wasting their time?
Well, that's a great question for all librarians, I would say. There's not going to be much of a paper trail unless you know, you're lucky. It's only the British Library where you've seen this. It's a printed thing, or?
Yeah, it's in the Thomason tract.
Oh, Thomason. Okay, so that relates to Amina's work as well with the Revolution. Okay, yeah. A lot of times there isn't a God here, you know. Something's attributed because someone else said it, and you know, it might have been said in 1820, and just keeps getting recycled in that way. You're also sort of asking about who do you appeal to if you think something's wrongly done, is really what your question is, right?
Yeah, I mean, is it sort of like, here's the curiosity in a footnote, the British Library thinks it's this person, but I disagree. Or is it like, they probably had a really good reason, so I should actually hunt really hard for why they said that?
No, not often. They don't. I mean, sometimes they, you know, somebody just made the suggestion. I mean, I think sometimes, I mean, there are cases where institutions will change records to reflect a change in who they think is the author of a work. It takes time and energy to do that, but it does happen. So,
Okay, so it's like worth sending them an email and being like, hey,
yes,
do you have a reason? Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, if you can get a cataloger interested in the problem, they might be very kind of potentially interested in helping that, something change. It happens. And at the British Library level, they have power to influence, make those choices. Not all libraries do.
I would add that I love when people send me corrections, and I always, even if I'm not able to make those corrections, I almost always try to include that information somewhere. We previously had thought that it was this person. There's new evidence that it may be this person. So we're not necessarily going to authoritatively say that kind of information, but if you have good reasons, we're always happy to include additional information. As archivists at a special collections, every single day, the work that I do is completely different. I'm never an expert on the subject that I'm processing. I mean, Jewish artists one day, musicians the next day, and, Chinese research material the next day. So there's no way I'm ever an expert, and I am perfectly willing to admit that. So.
Thanks. I think Christian wants to say something about this.
Yeah, Christian.
I just wanted to jump in. I mean, it's a great question, Jonathan, but I had the delightful pleasure of spending a year and a half in the Leibniz archives in Münster, the Forschungsstelle there. And one of the wonderful things about sort of working with our real scholars there is that there are so many attributions that were false, that other, people had said, it looks to me like this is a letter from so-and-so, whatever it is. So librarians do the very best job they can, right? But often that's just kind of a placeholder. And a little bit, in my feeling is that if it doesn't feel right, then it might really, it's probably not right. And so, but then you have to do a little research or looking around to discover that. But no offense to the librarians here, but there's just so many, quick decisions that get made that look like they're written in stone, but in fact, it's just a good guess from the perspective of knowing a lot less than maybe So
that's right. And I think one of the problems we all have is the power of something in a database can be dramatic. Once it's there, it sometimes seems hard to eradicate, maybe very locally, but it's, printed books have this problem, I think, more in some cases than particular archives collections that are unique to one institution. Something is said to be authored by someone, it will get recycled down the line, and the big data, the USDC or ESDC will pick it up, and it can be hard to change.
Well, thank you.
Lisa?
I'll see if my internet holds steady with the camera on. I just want a quick question following up on Jackie's comment. Jackie, I think I heard you say it was your transcription of, so not a digital image, but an actual transcription of something that ran up against copyright. And I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's sort of like, so you can't reproduce part of you can't reproduce it in full, or you can't reproduce part of it if you want to use that text in an argument. Like how?
I think, well, in the case of so there were two libraries, the Northamptonshire Records Office in my case, and I think I could have used part of the poem. I wanted to use a whole poem, and so I think I could have used part of it to get around the orphans copyright thing. And my colleague had a case where the British Library wouldn't let him publish an entire letter. And there I suggested that maybe he could have published part of it, but it was about full works, yes.
Oops, thanks.
I have a question. Do we know if lawsuits are being brought about this? I mean, if there's nobody who really has an investment in these works because they're 400 years old or something like that. So the question, and you can have the law, but is anyone actually, enforcing it? beyond institutions saying that.
Yeah,
you-
libraries being so hyper cautious to
Yeah.
the point of
Yeah.
absurdity.
Yeah, Lynn, I get the feeling it was just the library taking a very strict interpretation of the orphan copyright law. And when I raised it with a Cambridge librarian, oh, the Northamptonshire Records Office told me they can't give me permission to even use it, and she said that sounded like a very strict interpretation. So I don't think it's a case of lawsuits, but just a fear of them, perhaps.
Yeah, I wonder who could bring those lawsuits, or who would be bringing those lawsuits, because the institution doesn't really have any copyright claim on that material either, it would seem. I don't know. I'm just raising that. Marguerite.
Thanks. I think my question is for Christine, if she's still available, but also the rest of you, because the Morgan Library in New York, for example, I look at 16th century things mostly, and it's a private institution, clearly not a public one. And when you take digital photographs, they require that you put this little piece of paper that says Morgan Library in every image, which is fine. But they also require that you ask for permission to reproduce any of those, to publish any of those images. And the British Library still has on its website that you must obtain their permission. And again, for 16th century things that clearly no one holds the copyright on any longer. So I'm wondering, and I guess Jackie's experience is making me nervous. I have assumed that in a volume of translations that I'm planning to publish, that I could reproduce, or that it would not be difficult to obtain the permission to reproduce, say, an image of a single page from different manuscripts. But what I'm wondering about, Christine, really is, why do the libraries have these requirements that we ask for permission if in fact they have no legal basis for that? What are they worried about, I guess, is my concern.
So maybe the legal basis, at least in the United States, that they're operating under is a contractual kind of argument. In order to use our resources and services, these are the terms that you must follow in order to use these particular materials. And these things are not without cost. There are costs to digitize things. There are costs to preserve and house things. There's cost in terms of staff time to provide you access to these things. There's cost in terms of staff time to show you these things, to educate you on appropriate use of collections.
Mm-hmm.
So the financial contribution is usually that they ask for is usually pretty minuscule. It's mostly to account for all of those kind of invisible costs that come from a collection. Sometimes when a donor gives a gift to one of these institutions, they provide, within their donor agreement, you can't use the material in certain ways. And so sometimes they're passing on to you, the end user, kind of the same restrictions that they are under. And from an academic integrity perspective, providing attribution to the repository that things come from is actually very helpful to other researchers who come after you.
Yes.
Because if they want to study the same materials, they think, oh, this is where I need to go. It's sometimes hard to find out who has that information and those resources, as we've been talking about. Some of our other colleagues have mentioned some of the challenges in finding that information, and providing that attribution credit is, kind of academic good manners to all of the folks who might want to reference the same materials or maybe challenge or engage with your work in a different way. So it's an ecosystem, so to speak. So maybe if they're not necessarily coming from a copyright perspective, but maybe trying to situate what you're doing within the larger ecosystem of how they work.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Can I just quickly ask the librarians, am I right to presume that libraries in general will grant permission for reasonable requests for scholarly publications to publish a portion of something?
Sure. I think I would hope so. I mean, I was going to say, my answer small, not nearly as Christine's answer is everything, but I also would just, unfortunately, there's custom. Libraries do it because it was done this way. 50 years ago, people filled out permission requests. It's been done that way, and it's sometimes hard to shuck these things off that have lingered into the era where you can take your own photographs in a collection and all these things that didn't used to be possible. It really is a sort of, I think some of it a holdover from a different kind of academic culture of where, sort of deference to library holders was somehow seen as an absolute rule of the road, even if it has no legal basis. I mean, I'm delighted not to write permissions. I mean, what a pain in the neck and waste of time, but for things that don't need it, but you do want the credit right. So yeah, I think it's surprising to find libraries who aren't happy to have their stuff out there nowadays with the right information about it and the good edition that you're making or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things we determined a long time ago was it made no economic sense to charge fees.
The labor of getting the money in, you've just blown it. I mean, but not all places, have come to that same conclusion. Yeah.
Just chiming in and adding one point that might be more relevant when you're seeking like an image. Sometimes the repository really is the only place you can get that really awesome, high resolution, gorgeous scan, publication ready than what you could get maybe on your iPhone screen, in a dark reading room under less than ideal conditions. So, they often make those really high resolution images available to you as like a service. And if it's an academic use you're trying to make, they're probably charging you a pretty nominal fee because they really want you to use that high resolution, amazing image as opposed to like the tiny cell phone shot that you can take yourself. So, it's a balance and what kind of use you might want to be making with the end result. It might be that the only place that you can get that particular thing that would suit your needs would be from the repository directly.
Yeah, and I think, sadly, I think there are some collections and some European collections that use costs as deterrents, charging a high price to discourage people asking for things. That is a barrier. That can be a real barrier to graduate students who are on low budgets trying to publish an article. It's a real thing. I see it all the time. I wish it weren't so, but it still is in some cases.
On that note, I think we should take a break unless Christia has a really short thing she wants to say, but I would like to take a short break.
Well, just I guess really short is that what I've found is that some things are cheaper in one library than another. So there are some libraries that are making things easier and cheaper. But of course, if you're looking at something very specific, it's the only library, it's only available in one place, and you have to negotiate. But a very quick question, which maybe we can talk about over the break. But I use a lot of art historical matters in some of my publications, and work a lot with art historians and historians of science. And I had understood that anything you take a picture of, it belongs to you. And I know that's true in Italy. At least my Italian friends there do that. So have I just misunderstood? So a lot of people have these really fancy phones these days, and they take photographs in libraries and also in museums. And as far as I understood it, it's theirs.
May I just add something, John?
Yeah, sure.
This is not French law. So be careful. French law depends on the date. And if their photographer has ever photographed the image for any reason, it belongs to the photographer technically. It's very complex, and you don't always have permission to photograph there. So really, in France, be careful.
That's super interesting because that's not true in Italy.
I know, but its law is nation dependent.
Yeah, Eva will tell us here.
I just want to point out that what Christy is saying is perfectly right about Italy. If we're speaking of private use, of course, you cannot do the images as covers of books or to publish them as part of books. But as long as you use them in your private study, you're good to go. I'm going to mention that in my paper, actually.
Okay, I think we should take a, let's see what time it is. Let's take a 5-minute break and come back at 3:15. Okay. It was a short break. I don't know if everyone's back yet.
Jonathan had to go read bedtime stories to his young philosopher, so he had to.
I might just get started since we're running a little late here. I want to introduce Joan DeJean. She's the trustee professor of Romance languages at the University of Pennsylvania. And I love her bio. She says, over the course of nearly 5 decades of research and writing, she has learned 2 things about herself. More than anything, she loves digging in an archive. Someone recently called her un rat d'archive, an archive rat, and she's devoted above all to recovering the lives of women overlooked in the histories of early modern France. Her forthcoming book, Mutinous Women, recreates the story of French women arrested in Paris in 1719 on trumped-up charges so that they could be shipped off to the immense French territory in what is now the United States. These women were lost to history, but right there in the archives. Joan?
Hi, everyone. I'm hoping that my internet connection holds. John Pollack has control of the images, so we're going to give this a go. I'm going to race through this because we're running late and I'm not sure it will interest any of you from what I've said, but it's what I've prepared. I wanted to give a couple of examples of the use of an archive, which for anyone in the French-speaking world is readily available, and that is notarial archives. And in Paris, there's a huge archive and you can easily access it and dig. In all major French cities they exist, and they exist wherever the French set up shop. So Quebec, New Orleans, etc. And you have all kinds of information. I'm going to show, John, if you could put up the first slide, that would start us. This is an example. I'm going to take you through a number of documents. For years, for decades, I tried to avoid the notary's archives because they seem so boring. It's all dry information about finance, etc. But you learn so much about people and especially about women. You can recover information on women's lives that you can't recover anywhere else. If any of you are working on any French women figures who have and you can't know that they lived in a city where they're notaries, dig. No one could become a writer, a philosopher, have any major role if they didn't have some financial and social stability. And the notaries' archives teach us all about what their lives were. This is the first page of something. I'm going to do several documents of the same kind. If I were in Paris, I know exactly what I would get, but I'm not in Paris, so I couldn't photograph them. So I substituted with the documents that were available. The first ones are from an archive, a family archive that Penn has and that Holly recently cataloged. And I'm going to take you through a few pages just to show the kinds of information you find. I chose the same kind of document because women are always of necessity involved in this marriage contracts. And this is the first page of a marriage contract. The original of this would be in Paris in the archive of the notary who drew it up. The copy was sent here for a reason we have in the archive here for a reason I'll explain in a minute. And it goes through, it's the first page of a marriage from 1813. And you learn in the beginning of these documents, the first pages of any marriage contract, who's who. It's the social foundation of the marriage that's laid out. 1813 is the date, 26th of June, 1813. If any of you are readers of novels, you know that at that precise moment in 1813, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice was published. And Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is one of the monuments in the history of marriage for that fairy tale that any woman, any intellectually challenging woman could find a husband like Mr. Darcy, a wealthy man. Austen begins by mentioning money and status. Well, in this case, let's look at what this marriage was. The man is someone called Lalouette. And Lalouette was 36. He was an artillery officer. He was marrying a young woman called Marie Floride Parseval. Florida, yes, was her name. The French of the early 19th century had great names. And she was 22. However, the marriage contract teaches us immediately that he was no Mr. Darcy. The power was all hers. He has nice people to stand up for him, brothers, sisters, cousins, what you would think. Her family relations are immediately a great uncle who was a baron. So she's got the social connections, and we learn why right after her name, that these documents also show the professions. It's really important if you're studying early modern women to know where they came from, what their families did, because that will tell you why they were able to do what they did. In her case, her father, who was no longer alive, he was a victim of the guillotine during the revolution, but her father had been an aristocrat. He'd purchased the title because he was a farmer, fermier général, a tax farmer. In other words, he raised taxes for the French government, and he got to keep a share of those taxes. So the social connections were hers and the money was hers. Can we go to the second one, please, John? And this is page 3 of the contract. You get to the articles. In other words, the money. How much money is involved. And you learn from this that the social connections were hers and the money was hers too. So in other words, all of this, the finances of the marriage are laid out in a contract. And you have to know this kind of information to know how women had the ability to live their lives as intellectuals. In this case, the archive arrived here because the marriage is in 1813, but the archive was is important because it fast forward to 1821, and the artillery officer is no longer a good profession. After Waterloo, many young French officers, army officers, leave France. There's a massive immigration post-Waterloo in those years, and a massive immigration, interestingly enough, to territory that's no longer French. The colony that was French, Louisiana, in this country has a huge emigration wave at that point from former Napoleonic officers. So Lalouette took a chunk of the money that his wife brought into the marriage, and he left, came to this country and bought a huge tract of land in Alabama, near Mobile, Alabama. And the archive was all preserved there. He also began at that point writing letters. And John, if we could move to number 3, and the archive contains them. He wrote letters home to his wife. And there's a long correspondence over several years, and they're very beautiful letters. They teach us exactly what the marriage was. And the marriage was in every way a full partnership. They are financial partners. He tells her what to send from France that he might be able to sell. Notably, French wine would be an excellent thing to send to this country. He also tells her about what is economically the ways of the new ways of the world in this place where he is. And it's a wonderful source of information of the huge transformation of the economy in the southern part of this country. Cotton. He tells you that cotton has just begun to be sold for the first time in the Mobile market, how much it costs, things like that. So in other words, this is a marriage in which she was a full economic partner in the marriage. They also had a marriage which is a full family partnership. It's interesting that someone has just dropped off to read to a child. Lalouette does not correspond to the standard early modern description of the distanced father. He was actively involved in the education and the life of the family and his children, and he's always have a conversation about the children. In addition, finally, the marriage, it was truly a love match. The dialogue between the two spouses is very touching. And so I concluded the close of a letter from May 1822, a year after his travels begin. And here's the close of that letter. Embrasse bien mes petits enfants pour moi et je leur recommande d'être bien sages. So give my children a big kiss for me, and I hope that they are being good. I hope and tell them I count on them to be good. Another letter a year further on ends with Adieu, chers enfants, embrassez bien maman pour moi. Good night, dear children. Give maman a big kiss for me. It all seems quite modern, despite all the distance in there. In other words, the correspondence and the marriage contract together give us a portrait of something that's like Jane Austen's dream, marriage as a full partnership. And so the archive can show you how marriage is changing, how family life is changing, how the life of a family, parents and their children is changing at the period. And now, if you don't mind, John, the last image, I'm moving really fast. You can ask me if you want to know more. This is an example of something else. Most marriage contracts end with an annex of some sort. And these are things that are particularly important to the people involved in the marriage, and they want to make sure that these conditions are, and the property described is mentioned in these things. This is one from New Orleans, a French document done by a French notary in New Orleans, and it's a marriage from 1747. New Orleans, 1747. The bride was a very young woman, Marie-Catherine Laroche. She was 16, and her stepfather, at the end of this, her father had been killed. Her stepfather wrote up at the end of the document something he wanted to have added. État des affaires de ménage et hardes que je donne à Marie-Catherine Laroche, fille de ma femme et moi son beau-père. So it's a list, an accounting of all the objects and clothing and property that I give to Marie-Catherine Laroche, the daughter of my wife, from me, her father-in-law. It's always reported in histories of marriage that fathers-in-law, mothers-in-law are very distant from those children that they raise. And this document, and when you read the whole document in context, shows that this father-in-law, stepfather, I'm saying father-in-law, stepfather had really a sense that this was his daughter, that he had raised her and there was an involvement with her. Now, Marie-Catherine Laroche was no philosopher. She went on to become a huge real estate tycoon in New Orleans. But what I'm trying to show you is that these notarial documents can teach us a lot about the history of the family and of women's lives. There's a history of marriage, a history of childhood. And if you dig in them, you can find all these things. And they can also show you, if you know where to look and if you dig for them, women philosophers. If you know any women you're interested in who are French women, and you know that they were in Paris or a city, Lyon, for example, with notarial archives, try to dig them out. What you learn about them is always extraordinarily interesting. I'm always so grateful when I've gone through the notary for any woman, for all I've learned about them. For example, and this is someone I want to promote in the end. Lynne mentioned the Other Voice in Early Modern series initially in her remarks. Some of the women cited there, I think, should be considered philosophers. And here's one I'd really promote, Madeleine de Scudéry. Scudéry was the most read novelist in Europe in the 17th century. She's still being read in English translation actively well into the 18th century. Scudéry's novels are huge. Her novel Artamène is, thank you, Lisa, I totally agree. Her novel Artamène is, and I quote, I'm sure of this, the longest published novel anywhere. It's huge. And one of the reasons it's so huge is that it contains many dialogues. A group of participants, male and female in the novel, characters in the novel, get together and they discuss topics. They discuss marriage, they discuss friendship, they discuss the emotions, they discuss things that are common problems and issues in women's lives, and they give opinions on what is love, what is friendship, and all of these together. Scudéry collected some of them into volumes later on in her life, but there's a whole outlook on life, which is the outlook of Scudéry, I would argue also of her generation, and of a group of women who were her close friends. And notarial archives on this group would provide something extraordinary, I think. For Scuderi herself, we have all kinds of documents. She cared so much about the property she rented and the work on it. And so you have a real sense of a woman who knew that to write, and she stresses this often in her conversations, if you want to become a woman intellectual, you really need not only money, but a room of your own. And so the work between Scuderi and her landlords, those documents are wonderful. And they give a real portrayal of the life of a woman who devoted herself to the life of the mind. In addition, the women in her circle, and they all lived in the Marais in Paris. Her home was on the Rue de Beauce, and the women who were close to her lived very nearby. They often used the same notaries. And when they married, their marriage contracts are dynamite. These women tried for absolute equality. They were giving themselves in marriage, not their fathers. And the appendices to their marriage contracts. I'm sorry to have this because it's just clothing, but the women who were close to Scuderi in her circle would put an appendix to their marriage contract listing the books they brought into the marriage. And the men they married also put an appendix listing their libraries. So you have in those cases real meetings of minds. I think that these women who are often disparaged by French history, just dismiss them as precious women, les précieuses. In fact, they were truly women who thought about trying to reform women's lives and the things basic to women's lives, including the institution of marriage. So I think I would go there to something like this and say that any kind of notarial archive, these dry documents, these dry facts are full of information, in fact, on the kinds of women who become intellectual women. Okay, I tried to do this as quickly as possible so you could gain some time. And I'm happy to answer questions, but I think I thought you probably don't have the time for more right now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was great. And it's so fascinating, the work that you've done in those archives. Our last speaker is Eva Del Soldato, who's an associate professor of Romance languages in the graduate chair for Italian at the University of Pennsylvania. She was trained in philosophy and intellectual history at the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa. Her research is primarily devoted to Renaissance thought and culture with a special attention to the Aristotelian and Platonic traditions. She also cultivates interest in history of the book, history of libraries and universities, and in 20th century cultural institutions. Eva?
Whoops, I will never learn. First of all, I would like to thank Lynne Farrington for this generous introduction and for organizing this beautiful event. I've learned so much. And I'm very happy to share with you my experiences in Italian archives as a woman historian of philosophy in working in archives. Still founded on idealistic models, which were dominant in the last century, Italy's scholastic system is based on history. I would like to add, thank God, since the country definitely needs it. On a more practical level, this historicist structure has been decisive in shaping the way a number of disciplines are taught and practiced within Italian schools, from first grade to the doctoral programs and beyond. For this reason, even in the field of philosophy, historians have so far managed to maintain a strong, if not dominating position. And these historians of philosophy are common presences in libraries and archives, attracted, as Mark Bloch famously said of historians, like augurs by the smell of the blood. I was 21 when I used for the first time the Iter Italicum, the list of Italian manuscripts collected in 6 volumes by Paul Oscar Christeller, and it was an epiphany. It was the idea that what we have available on our shelves will never be enough and can always be expanded, complemented, improved, and also that canons can be challenged and revised once you're able to find the right document or unearth a work considered lost. I studied at the Scuola Normale in Pisa, where the legacy of the great historian of philosophy, Eugenio Guérin, is still alive, and that shaped my interest. Garen and his students, including myself to my mentors, have typically a double expertise on two main focuses of research, the Renaissance period and the 20th century. Again, this double expertise has a historiographical explanation. A scholar like Garen, who lived under the fascism, looked at the Renaissance to find lessons for his tragic present. This created a tradition that coupled the study of early modernity and the study of 20th century authors. Yet, going to the archive to study long dead men and women is a very different experience from studying authors who recently passed away. I would like to share a few experiences I had in both contexts of research. The main problem you can have with Italian archives when working on early modern material is the embarrassment of riches. Italian archives, at least those which are part of the state system, are dramatically underfunded and understaffed. Most of them do not have Wi-Fi connection, and probably so. This means that even consulting the catalog could become extremely complicated. The COVID pandemic has made these issues even more visible, if possible. At the Archivio di Stato in Bologna, only 2 persons a day can use the terminal with the online catalog on the basis of mysteriously pre-assigned seats. At the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, you can only see 3 pieces a day, and the same is true of Florence. If, like me, you need to look at documents from trials, university rolls, or at single letters of the authors you're studying, this means that to look at the corpus of 10 documents, you may need to invest 3 or 4 days. Certainly not an effective plan. What can save you in these circumstances are the great positivist scholars of the late 19th century, like Francesco Fiorentino and Luigi Amabile, who publish volumes of documents and transcriptions. These publications can sometimes save you frustrating battles at the archive. Also, they teach you that nothing is more unpublished than the published. Not only the documents in these books are little read, but many times have been read wrongly and denazed. Just last month, when I was in Florence working on the 16th century Italian philosopher Andrea Cesalpino, I was lucky to find a rare booklet published in the early 20th century by an Arezzo printing press. In fact, Cesalpino was from Arezzo, and these erudite booklets, full of local pride, were typical products of post-Risorgimental Italy. Well, the tiny unpretentious booklet contained all the letters by Cesalpino in the Fondo Magliabechiano, in chronological order. Some of them allowed me to solve a crucial biographical crux. In 1592, Cesalpino left Pisa for Rome, called by Pope Clement VIII to become his personal physician. Yet, also according to the entry in the Dizionario Biografico degli Italiani, usually reliable, one of the reasons that pushed Cesalpino out of Pisa was being accused by the Platonist Francesco De Vieri, around 1590, of being a follower of the anti-Aristotelian Bernardino Telesio, whose main work was placed in the index in 1596. Such an open defamation campaign seemed weird to me, especially considering the role landed in Rome by Cesalpino a few years later and his solid Aristotelian allegiance. Also, I was not able to find any link connecting the Cesalpino and Telesio, aside from a 1588 volume printed in Geneva, which included works by the 2 philosophers, works which were nonetheless coupled precisely because in stark opposition. The solution was in the letters both Cesalpino and Verino sent to their common patron Baccio Valori to settle a private dispute. It was evidently a misreading of these documents that created the false narrative perpetuated by the Dizionario Biografico. Cesalpino complained to Valori that Verino silently attacked him in a treatise entitled Vere Conclusioni, when referring to heretical teachers of philosophy and medicine from whom one learns wicked principles and deduces wicked conclusions. Indeed, to contribute to Cesalpino's impression was that in the passage in question, Verino also praised as good teachers some of his colleagues in Pisa without mentioning Cesalpino. Hence, he believed that was an implicit accusation. When Cesalpino confronted Verino about this, Verino claimed that he was not attacking Cesalpino, but rather unidentified Telesiani, that is, followers of Telesio. This defense did not satisfy Cesalpino, who argued that in Pisa there was no trace of Telesiani. The patron, Baccio Valori, reassured Cesalpino and advised him not to bother further with the issue. Verino himself was happy to put the incident behind him as soon as possible. In a few words, there was no public defamation campaign, but rather a short-lived private quarrel between magistri based on an allusion. And most importantly, Verino did not accuse Cesalpino of being a follower of Telesio. On the contrary, he mentioned the Telesiani to explain that Cesalpino was certainly not his target. The lesson here is that to understand the context for the evolution in the thought and career of a philosopher like Cesalpino, this kind of archival evidence is decisive and needs to be read slowly. The Arezzo booklet is in fact regularly quoted in footnotes and articles claiming that Verino accused Cesalpino of being a Telesiano. Also, these documents have to be read as part of a full context as much as possible. In this case, having both Cesalpino's and Verino's letters was indeed particularly important to grasp the full narrative. Reading these documents at the archive would certainly be preferable, but when there are issues of accessibility, like now because of the pandemic, erudite compilations like the Arezzo booklet can be very precious placeholders. I was talking about letters, and I want to say one more thing about this material before moving to my experiences with 20th century archives. Italy is a country of collectors, and in the 19th century, this became a mania. In Italian archives, there are amazing collections of autograph letters of important authors, including the Autografoteca Campori in Modena, the Piancastelli in Forlì, the Ferraioli in Vatican City. And these are only a few examples. I'm mentioning these collections because many times they contain treasures that are passed over by scholars. Traveling to Forlì is not easy. From Florence, there is only one slow train crossing the Appennino that arrives in Forlì after too many stops. And yet, my trip to the local archive to look at the single letter of the Fondo Piancastelli was a game changer when I was writing my PhD dissertation on a 16th century Aristotelian, Simone Porzio. The letter was the proof I was looking for that the philosopher desperately wanted to leave Naples, suffering under the regime of the Viceroy Pedro de Toledo. The letter was addressed to Alessandro Farnese in Rome, and yet, thanks to Piancastelli, it was in Forlì waiting to be read and discovered. This small collection have to be explored, even if you need to cross the Apennine to do so. Also, experiences like the one I had in Forlì made me particularly appreciative of smaller archives, state-run and not. Smaller archives are not overrun like those I mentioned before, Venice, Bologna, Firenze, but also Roma and Naples. The archivist is normally extremely familiar with the collection and eager to share with scholars its content. Nowadays, obtaining reproduction for personal use is easy, even in bureaucratic Italy. You just need to have a smartphone and to complete a form. Years ago, it was a pain in the neck. And yet, even then, the smaller institutions were efficient in sharing their material. A small library in Apulia wanted to help me so badly that, both to my horror and delight, scanned the only surviving copy of a 16th century booklet. The Archivio di Forlì gave me a free reproduction of the letter by Porzio I studied, and so did the Archivio di Modena, when at that time the same document in Florence would have cost me at least 10 euros. An archivist in Pescia brought me a number of local publications and worked with me in the reading room in order to find documents on the Della Barba family I was studying. Also, from a human point of view, in sum, working in small archives is an extremely rewarding experience. Private archives are also usually small and easier to navigate, unless you're working on recently deceased personality, something that may impose a number of limitations. This has been the case of my experience in Rome with the archive of the Civiltà Cattolica, the most important Catholic periodical in Italy, published by Jesuits. At that time, I was working on the complicated collaboration between Giovanni Gentile and the Jesuit father Enrico Rosa. Gentile was the leading cultural and intellectual figure of fascist Italy, in addition to being the driving force behind reforms of the Italian school system that have survived in part to the present day. Gentile was a controversial figure. He was a staunch follower of fascism, even after Mussolini implicitly rejected Gentile's pretense of being a sort of official philosopher of the regime, and was killed by partisans in 1944. Yet, Gentile surrounded himself with collaborators who were non-anti-fascist and contributed to save the lives of several Jewish scholars, including Paul Oscar Christeller, after the implementation of the racial laws. Father Enrico Rosa, on the other hand, was a staunch critic of democracy, but also harbored doubts about fascism. As the director of the Civiltà Cattolica, he had a powerful platform from which to make his views known, and this led to the destruction of the editorial office by fascist agitators on 2 occasions. While Gentile rejected the interference of the church in the life of the fascist state as a philosophical principle, Rosa wanted the church to influence politics, especially for the education of the youth. This strange couple ended up collaborating at the Enciclopedia Italiana, a monumental enterprise directed by Gentile, for which Rosa wrote a number of entries that rarely made Gentile happy. A small part of their correspondence is conserved at the Department of Philosophy of La Sapienza in Rome, where you can read Gentile's paper at his own desk. That part of my research was therefore very easy. It was harder to access the letters conserved at the Archivio della Civiltà Cattolica. I was initially denied access to the archive, and this did not come as a surprise. For a number of reasons, very few non-Jesuit scholars have been admitted into the archive in recent years. The Archivio della Civiltà Cattolica contains, after all, controversial material, including letters related to the position maintained by the Roman Curia towards Jews, also during the Second World War. Nonetheless, I persisted. According to the Italian law, if a relative requests to access material about his deceased dear ones, he or she cannot be denied access to it. This is how I met Nicoletta Pescarolo, granddaughter of Giovanni Gentile. The recommendation of Miss Pescarolo opened to me the doors of the archive, where I was finally allowed to work for 2 days under the surveillance of the archivist. I arrived with a box of chocolate for the archivist, and these days were just pure bliss. The Jesuits gave me their imprimatur, literally, and my article, based on the material from the archive, was printed in one of the many journals founded by Gentile. More importantly, after that visit, the Archivio della Civiltà Cattolica became less impenetrable, and many important books that appear in the last decades have taken advantage of that collection. And even more importantly, I've learned that bringing chocolate and make an Italian archivist happy meant make my work easier and more pleasant. Everything I said about my experiences in Italian archives can largely be reaffirmed about Italian libraries. In terms of material, the distinctions are quite blurred. Working there may be often an exercise in patience, but as I mentioned above, many times these institutions work on tiny budgets and do not have enough staff to meet all the requests they receive. In the Sala Rari of the Nazionale in Florence, a recently retired librarian decided to come back on a volunteer basis twice a week to help his colleagues. And this story is far from being an exception. Definitely, they would all deserve much more chocolate. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. That was great. Both of you were great. And I think we could take some questions now. It looks like we've got about 10 minutes. So if there are any questions for either Joan or Eva or anything, any of us, please feel free to ask. Marguerite.
Thank you both, Joan and Eva. I have a question for both of you, I think. I'm interested in finding lists of the women I work on, I'm interested in discovering what might have been in their libraries. And I had thought of wills, but I had not thought of marriage documents. So Joan, I was very interested to hear you say that in France, at least, they might have been included. So I would like to ask Eva, do you know, would that also have been true in Italy? That is, would marriage records have the notarial documents around marriages, might they have included lists of books that were brought into the marriage?
I'm thinking mostly of wills and inventories made at the death of an author. These are quite common in Italy, but probably you are familiar with these reserves, but I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share it with all of you, since you were speaking about libraries of philosophers. This is a project that is run by the Scuola Normale di Pisa, and I'm trying to paste it, and the University of Cagliari, and its Library of Philosophers. And you can find lists of books owned by philosophers, intended in the large sense of the word, the one John was referring to before. And I don't know if there's anything that can be interesting for you, because I think there are very few women in our inventory so far. But if some of you is interested in collaborating, this is a great resource that I would love to see implemented. But to go back to your question, in terms of notarial documents, even more than marriage documents, I think that death documents can be a more promising way to find this kind of records in Italy.
Lisa?
I think Joan wanted to add something, and you just have to unmute, Joan.
Yes, okay. So I would say in France there's a big difference. The documents, the wills, do list what they tend to. Wills are set up, they're done at this point by the inventory is done by someone, usually a notary, once again, who's trying to establish the value of the collection. So in the case of Scudéry, I know what books were there at the time of her death, and they would list them like 300 volumes in duodecimo worth this. They don't care about what the books were, they care about the number and the worth. However, when these women, that's why I mentioned the marriage contracts, when they grew up their own lists, they wanted you to see what they owned and the husbands owned. And so you really have a sense of a couple who were together because they had shared reading interests. And that's something you don't have with wills. You can find them for very wealthy individuals and more expensive books. And sometimes this applies to classical books. So classical philosophers, those might be listed because they're in quarto. They're worth enough to have that, but you won't have it for novels or anything, the kinds of works by women you've been seeing in copies today.
Thank you both very much.
Lisa?
Yeah, thanks both of you. I think one thing that, Joan, your images just made me want to highlight is that when you're digging into these archival materials, you have to learn how to read the handwriting.
Yes.
And have the patience to do that. But it comes, right? The more you look at them, it just, you see what's being written. So just for the younger scholars who might have been intimidated by the writing, I just wanted to flag that. But I guess I mean, I would love to talk with you another time. One of the things that I'm finding very challenging right now, and I hadn't thought of looking at notarial records, and now I've got to figure out which notaries to go to is I'm really interested in Gabrielle Souchon, whose writings are super, whose philosophy is super interesting, but so little is known about her. And just trying to figure out, I had a thought, just, you know, like just trying to even figure out what routes to go down. There's a lot of blind alleys out there. And I just, I guess I want to take advantage of this opportunity to ask you, you know, for some ideas. I had a thought that she might have been either a student or a teacher at the Maison Saint-Louis at Saint-Cyr, and but there's a catalog, there was an exhibit in the early 2000s that includes a catalog of all the students and teachers who were registered there, and her name is not there. So that lead just came up short. So
I don't know where was she a Parisian? I'm not.
No, she was not a Parisian. She was from Semur, en Auxerrois.
Aren't you lucky?
Indeed,
This is your
Joan.
golden moment. The best genealogical society in France, and anyone will confirm this, they're fabulous, is the Genealogical Society of Lyon, the river, Société Généalogique de Lyon. Write them. They have never even allowed me. They won't let me make the trip, this huge trip there. The guys love to do it. They check the notaries and they'll check.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh, yeah. So Semur-en-Auxerrois is the best place to have been born, in my opinion, in the 18th century. And write them, and someone will answer. I mean, they really do answer.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm so glad
Sure.
you're here to answer this question. That's great.
I just wanted to chime in that, you know, one of the things that more places are doing and can help young scholars who are having a hard time with writing, there's a lot of paleography being taught at all different levels. And you know, I recommend that if you are planning to work in a different, you know, a specific time period in a specific area, you know, it's worth seeing if you can take a class that teaches you how to read some of those documents, because I think that's a really important piece of it. I know we do some of that kind of teaching here at Penn, and I'm sure it's happening elsewhere as well, but I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind.
And Newberry offers courses, for example, on Renaissance material, the Folger on early modern England, but definitely, you know, and there's often ways to practice before you hit the wall of arriving in a place and oh my God, I can't read any of this. You don't have to be reading things that are on your subject matter to be reading things that can give you practice with hands.
And there are great summer schools too. So
yes, it's a good use of summer time.
Do we have any other questions before we conclude today's session? Well, if not, I would like to thank everybody, both the presenters and everyone who attended today. This was a really fascinating, I mean, for me too, I always love to hear from my colleagues and to hear your questions as well. So thank you so much for coming, and for all of you who participated, thank you again.
And if you have follow-up questions, I'm sure we'd be happy to be in touch about them. You know, your projects are all at different stages, it sounds like, of course, and we're interested in learning more too.
I just typed it in the chat, but I do want to say I just want to thank Lynne so much for organizing all of you to do this and to pulling this off. This has been really fantastic and really helpful. I think just really great sessions. So thanks, Lynne, and thank you all for giving of your time and energy to be here and also to prepare for it. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Lisa, too, for the opportunity to to do it. It's a fascinating to think about this. Have a good weekend, everybody. Thank you, John.
I'll stop the recording.
Oh, okay.